My name is Isabella Howard, and I was 28 when I first walked through the weathered cedar doors of the Luminous Path Retreat Center in Pemaquid Point, Maine. The Atlantic crashed against the rocky coastline below, a constant rhythm that would become the soundtrack to 3 years of my life I'm still trying to understand. I came seeking clarity after my mother's sudden death from cancer. The grief had hollowed me out, left me floating through my marketing job in Boston like a ghost. When my college roommate mentioned a spiritual community that had helped her find purpose, I packed a weekend bag that somehow became permanent residence. The morning rituals began at 5:30. We gathered in the meditation hall as dawn painted the ocean silver, our bare feet silent on polished wood floors. Master Chen would guide us through breathing exercises, his voice barely above a whisper. "Release the toxins of yesterday's consciousness," he'd say, and we'd exhale in unison, our breath forming small clouds in the unheated space. The purification diet was strict. No processed foods, no caffeine, no sugar. Meals were communal affairs of steamed vegetables and brown rice, eaten in contemplative silence. We chewed each bite 30 times, focusing on gratitude for the earth's gifts. My body grew lean, my mind supposedly clearer, though sometimes I caught myself staring at the empty chair where someone had sat just days before, wondering where they'd gone without explanation. Emotional expression was discouraged outside of designated sharing circles. Reactive emotions cloud spiritual perception, Master Chen taught us. When my roommate Sophia Howard cried during meditation after receiving news of her father's illness, she was assigned additional purification practices. I watched her scrub the kitchen floors at midnight, her tears mixing with the soapy water, and said nothing. We weren't allowed personal phones or internet access. Digital noise disrupts energy alignment, the community guidelines stated. Letters from family were reviewed before delivery. My sister's messages arrived with certain paragraphs blacked out, though I was told this was to protect me from lower vibrational influences during my spiritual development. The work assignments rotated weekly: kitchen duty, grounds maintenance, administrative tasks. I spent hours in the office, filing donation records and membership applications. The numbers seemed large for such a small community, but questioning financial matters was considered a sign of spiritual immaturity. My spiritual development coach, Rebecca, met with me twice weekly in her private office overlooking the cliffs. She had kind eyes and spoke in measured tones about my exceptional spiritual potential. These sessions felt like the only place I could speak freely, though even there, certain topics seemed to make her uncomfortable. "You're progressing beautifully, Isabella," she'd say, making notes in my file. "But spiritual growth requires complete surrender of ego attachments. Are you ready for the next level of commitment?" The advanced practitioners lived in a separate wing of the main building. They wore white robes instead of the simple gray clothing the rest of us were assigned. They ate different meals, attended private teachings, and spoke in hushed tones about soul quarantine periods for those not yet ready for higher truths. I wanted to be ready. I wanted to belong to something larger than my grief, something that made sense of loss and suffering. When Rebecca suggested I might be selected for advanced training, I felt a flutter of hope I hadn't experienced since before my mother's diagnosis. But lately small things had begun to disturb the careful peace I'd constructed, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The locked filing cabinets in the office I'd never been asked to organize. The fact that Connor Howard, who'd been here longer than anyone, had started avoiding eye contact during meals. Last week, I'd found a crumpled note in the laundry room, tucked behind the industrial washing machine. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "They're watching everything. Trust no one. The debts aren't real." Before I could examine it further, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I quickly shoved the paper into my pocket. Now, as I sat in the pre-dawn darkness of my shared dormitory room, listening to Sophia's careful breathing and the ocean's endless rhythm, that note felt like it was burning through the fabric of my nightgown. The silence that had once felt sacred now pressed against my chest like a weight. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong here, and I was finally ready to admit it. The advanced training began 3 days after I found the note. Rebecca summoned me to her private office during the evening meditation hour, when the corridors were empty except for the soft shuffle of bare feet on polished wood. "Isabella, you've shown remarkable dedication to your spiritual development," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. The room smelled of sage and something else, something clinical that reminded me of hospitals. "I believe you're ready for a deeper level of commitment." She opened a leather-bound folder and withdrew several documents. The papers were thick, expensive-looking, with letterheads I didn't recognize. These are spiritual development contracts. They formalize your commitment to the advanced path and ensure you receive the intensive guidance you need. I leaned forward to read, but the language was dense, filled with terms I'd never encountered. Energetic debt obligations, karmic responsibility transfers, soul-level financial commitments. The numbers scattered throughout the pages made my stomach clench. Thousands of dollars I didn't have, couldn't possibly have. I don't understand, I said quietly. I thought the retreat was covered by my initial payment. Rebecca's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. Oh, Isabella, that was just the beginning. True spiritual growth requires sacrifice. These contracts ensure you're fully invested in your transformation. Without skin in the game, as they say, the ego finds ways to resist enlightenment. She explained that the advanced practitioners had all signed similar agreements. The financial obligations weren't meant to be paid immediately. They were spiritual tools, designed to create the proper mindset for growth. Think of it as energetic collateral, she said, a way of proving to the universe that you're serious about your path. The contracts outlined a complex system of spiritual debts that would accumulate based on my level of participation in advanced teachings. Private sessions with Rebecca, $500 each. Access to the restricted library, $200 monthly. Participation in purification ceremonies, $300 per session. The numbers climbed steadily as I read, creating a web of financial obligation that seemed designed to trap rather than enlighten. What if I can't pay? I asked. The community takes care of its own, Rebecca replied smoothly. There are work-study programs, ways to contribute your skills instead of money. Connor Howard, for instance, has been managing our digital presence in exchange for his spiritual education. Ariana Maxwell handles our legal documentation. Everyone finds their way to contribute. I signed the papers because I didn't know what else to do. Because Rebecca had been the only person to listen when I talked about my mother's death. The only one who seemed to understand the hollow ache that had driven me here. Because I was afraid that refusing would mean losing the only stability I'd found since my world collapsed. Over the following weeks, the advanced training revealed itself to be an intricate system of psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual practice. Rebecca scheduled our private sessions at odd hours, 2 a.m., dawn, during meals when my blood sugar was low and my thinking clouded. She recorded everything, claiming it was for my spiritual progress, but the way she positioned the device felt more like surveillance than support. Your resistance patterns are fascinating, she'd say, reviewing her notes from previous sessions. You have deep-seated trust issues stemming from your mother's abandonment through death. We need to work through these blocks before you can access higher consciousness. The sessions became increasingly invasive. She wanted details about my childhood, my relationships, my fears. She asked about my financial situation, my family's assets, whether I had access to inheritance or savings accounts. When I hesitated to answer, she framed my reluctance as spiritual resistance. The ego protects its secrets, she'd explain. But secrets are what keep us trapped in lower vibrational states. Complete transparency is the only path to freedom. I began to notice how the other advanced practitioners moved through the retreat center, carefully, quietly, with the hypervigilant awareness of people walking on unstable ground. Connor Howard had dark circles under his eyes and a nervous habit of checking his phone obsessively. Ariana Maxwell flinched whenever Rebecca entered a room. During one late-night session, Rebecca pulled out a thick file with my name on it. Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen before, credit reports, bank statements, employment records. My hands shook as I recognized my social security number, my mother's death certificate, details about the small inheritance I'd received. How did you get these? I whispered. Isabella, you signed the transparency agreements. Complete openness, remember? We need to understand your full financial picture to properly structure your spiritual development plan. But I didn't remember signing anything that would give her access to my private records. The contracts had been so dense, so filled with spiritual language, that I trusted her interpretation. Now, looking at my most private information spread across her desk, I felt a cold understanding settle in my chest. Your mother left you $47,000, Rebecca continued, as if discussing the weather. That's exactly the amount needed to complete your advanced training program. The universe provides, doesn't it? The room felt smaller suddenly, the sage scent cloying. I never told you about the inheritance. You didn't need to. The spiritual realm reveals what needs to be known. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the hypnotic cadence I'd once found comforting. This money is keeping you trapped in material attachments, Isabella. Your mother's death was a gift, a chance for you to transcend earthly concerns and embrace your true spiritual nature. But you're clinging to her legacy instead of honoring it through growth. I stared at the papers, my mother's name typed in neat rows next to dollar amounts and account numbers. The inheritance had been my safety net, the one thing that made me feel secure enough to take risks, to try something like this retreat. Now Rebecca was suggesting I surrender it entirely. I need time to think, I managed. Of course, but remember, hesitation is the ego's way of maintaining control. The longer you wait, the stronger its grip becomes. That night I lay awake listening to Sophia's breathing and thinking about the crumpled note I'd hidden in my pillowcase. The debts aren't real. What if the entire financial structure Rebecca had created was fabricated? What if the spiritual contracts were just elaborate tools for extracting money from vulnerable people? I started paying attention differently. During meals, I noticed how the advanced practitioners ate smaller portions, how they seemed perpetually anxious despite their supposed spiritual progress. I watched Connor Howard's hands shake as he typed on his laptop in the common room, saw how he jumped when anyone approached his screen. One evening, while organizing supplies in the storage room, I found a box of old files that had been misfiled. Inside were contracts from former retreat participants, people I'd never met, who'd apparently left before I arrived. The financial obligations were staggering, and many of the files contained collection notices, legal threats, demands for payment of spiritual debts that had somehow become legally binding. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten letter from someone named Emma Howard, addressed to a legal aid organization. The spiritual development contracts are fraudulent, it read. Rebecca Winters has been using psychological manipulation to extract money from grieving and vulnerable people. She has access to private financial information through illegal means and uses it to pressure participants into signing away their assets. Please help. I'm afraid of what she'll do if she discovers I'm trying to leave. The letter was dated 6 months ago. I'd never heard Emma's name mentioned at the retreat. My hands were shaking as I photographed the letter with my phone, along with several of the contracts. The evidence was clear. Rebecca had been running this operation for years, targeting people in crisis, using their grief and desperation to fund her lifestyle while keeping them trapped through manufactured debt and psychological control. As I carefully returned the files to their box, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Rebecca's voice, speaking quietly to someone I couldn't see. Isabella's showing signs of resistance. We may need to accelerate her program before she becomes a problem. I pressed myself against the storage room wall, heart hammering, as their voices faded down the corridor. The silence that followed felt different now, not peaceful, but predatory. I was being hunted, and I'd just discovered I wasn't the first prey. The next morning I woke before dawn with Emma Howard's letter burned into my memory. The retreat felt different in the gray pre-sunrise light. The meditation bells sounded hollow. The morning affirmations felt like incantations designed to keep us compliant. I moved through the breakfast routine mechanically, spooning the prescribed quinoa porridge while my mind raced through escape scenarios. Rebecca watched me from across the dining hall, her smile too bright, too knowing. Isabella, you seem distracted this morning. Perhaps we should schedule an additional alignment session. I'm fine, I managed, forcing my voice to remain steady, just processing yesterday's breakthrough. She nodded slowly, but her eyes never left my face. Processing is important, but sometimes we can overthink our spiritual progress. Trust the process, trust me. After breakfast, I volunteered for kitchen duty, anything to avoid another private session with Rebecca. While washing dishes, I struck up a conversation with Sophia Howard, a newer arrival who'd been at the retreat for only 3 weeks. She was younger than me, maybe 25, with the same hollow look I'd probably worn when I first arrived. How are you finding the program? I asked quietly, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary force. Sophia glanced around nervously before answering. It's intense. Rebecca says I have significant karmic debt from past lives. The financial commitment is much higher than I expected. My stomach dropped. How much higher? She showed me documentation of my spiritual obligations. Apparently my energy signature indicates I owe the universe substantial restitution. $40,000 to start. Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. I had to liquidate my savings account yesterday. I nearly dropped the pot I was holding. $40,000. For a 25-year-old who'd been here 3 weeks. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. Sophia, I said carefully, has Rebecca ever shown you any official documentation, legal paperwork? She says traditional legal systems don't recognize spiritual law. That's why we have to handle these matters internally. Sophia's hands trembled as she dried a plate. But Isabella, I'm scared. I don't have any more money. And she says if I can't fulfill my obligations, my spiritual development will reverse. She says I could end up worse than when I started. That afternoon, I feigned a headache to skip the group meditation session. Instead, I returned to the storage room, this time with a small flashlight and my phone fully charged. I needed more evidence, more names, more proof of Rebecca's systematic exploitation. The files revealed a horrifying pattern spanning 5 years. Dozens of participants, each with escalating financial obligations tied to manufactured spiritual emergencies. Many had signed over property deeds, retirement accounts, inheritance money. The contracts were sophisticated, written in language that blended legal terminology with spiritual concepts in ways that would confuse anyone not trained in law. I found Connor Howard's file near the bottom of the stack. His spiritual debt had reached $60,000 before he'd apparently stopped making payments. The final document in his folder was a collection notice threatening, quote, karmic consequences and spiritual bankruptcy if he didn't resume payments immediately. But it was the next file that made my blood run cold. A psychiatric evaluation report, dated 2 months ago, for someone named James Howard. The report detailed severe anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation following his departure from what he described as a, quote, spiritual abuse situation. The evaluating psychiatrist had noted signs of complex trauma consistent with psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. I photographed everything, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots. As I worked, I heard voices approaching the storage area. Quickly, I shoved the files back into their boxes and switched off my flashlight, pressing myself into the corner behind a stack of meditation cushions. Rebecca's voice was unmistakable. We need to accelerate Isabella's program. She's been asking too many questions, and Connor mentioned seeing her near the storage area yesterday. What do you want me to do? The second voice belonged to Marcus, Rebecca's assistant who handled the financial aspects of the retreat. Initiate a spiritual emergency. Tell her we've discovered a critical karmic blockage that requires immediate intervention. Price it at $30,000 to start. We need to lock her in before she gets suspicious. And if she resists? Rebecca's laugh was cold. Then we remind her of the consequences of spiritual default. Show her James Howard's file if necessary. Sometimes fear is more effective than hope. Their footsteps faded, leaving me crouched in the darkness with the full scope of Rebecca's operation finally clear. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was systematic psychological terrorism, designed to break people down and rebuild them as sources of income. I waited 20 minutes before emerging from the storage room, my mind racing through options. I couldn't simply leave. Rebecca had copies of my identification, my emergency contacts, my financial information. She'd made it clear that spiritual defaulters faced consequences beyond the retreat's walls. But I also couldn't stay. Not now that I knew what happened to people who couldn't pay, who tried to resist, who asked too many questions. That evening, during the mandatory reflection period, I approached Connor Howard again. He was sitting alone in the garden, staring at his laptop screen, with the same haunted expression I'd noticed before. Connor, I said quietly, settling beside him on the bench, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He looked up, and I saw fear flash across his face. Isabella, you shouldn't. I found the files, I interrupted. I know about the spiritual debt contracts. I know about Emma Howard, about James Howard. I know what Rebecca is doing here. Connor's face went pale. He glanced around frantically, then leaned closer. You need to stop looking, you need to pay whatever she asks and get out quietly. Fighting her only makes it worse. Worse how? She has connections. People who help her collect on spiritual debts through traditional means. Legal harassment, credit destruction, employment sabotage. Emma Howard tried to expose her and ended up losing her job, her apartment, her reputation. Rebecca made sure everyone in Emma's life knew she was, quote, spiritually unstable. My heart sank. What about James Howard? Connor's voice dropped to barely a whisper. James tried to go to the police. Rebecca had him committed for psychiatric evaluation, claimed he was having a spiritual psychosis, and was a danger to himself and others. He spent 3 weeks in involuntary hold before he could convince anyone he was sane. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Rebecca hadn't just created a financial scam. She'd built an entire system of control that extended far beyond the retreat's boundaries. She had leverage over former participants, ways to destroy their lives if they tried to expose her operation. Connor, how are you still here? Why haven't you left? He gestured to his laptop screen, and I saw he was working on what looked like financial spreadsheets. I can't afford to leave. My spiritual debt is over $60,000 now. Rebecca offered me a deal. I help with the administrative work, keep the other participants in line, and she'll reduce my debt gradually. It's the only way I'll ever get free. You're helping her trap other people. I'm surviving, he said sharply, then immediately looked ashamed. Isabella, please. Just pay what she asks and leave quietly. Don't end up like Emma or James. Don't end up like me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, weighing my options. I could pay Rebecca's demands and leave quietly, but that would mean abandoning Sophia and the others still trapped in her web. I could try to expose her, but Connor's warnings about Emma and James made it clear that Rebecca had resources and connections I couldn't match alone. Or I could find a way to gather enough evidence to make a case so strong that Rebecca couldn't silence it through intimidation and manipulation. The next morning I made my decision. During breakfast I approached Rebecca with what I hoped looked like resignation. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, I told her, about the spiritual emergency you detected. I'm ready to discuss the intervention program. Rebecca's smile was triumphant. I'm so glad you're embracing this opportunity, Isabella. The universe has such beautiful plans for your growth. As she led me to her office to discuss the financial details of my supposed spiritual crisis, I activated the voice recording app on my phone, hidden in my jacket pocket. If I was going to take down Rebecca Winters, I needed her to incriminate herself in her own words. The hunt was about to begin, but this time, I would be the predator.